The basement wasn't just wet. It was drowning. The first sound Ethan Carter noticed wasn't the rushing water. It was the sharp, dangerous cracks of the fuse box, coughing against the invasion of the flood. Oi. Then came the sloshing. Heavy. Relentless. And finally the faint scream of a neighbor outside, cutting through the humid midnight air. He swung open the basement door, and the world tilted. His security camera caught the moment his silhouette froze. The water reflected his body like a distorted mirror, an inverted man staring at the ruin of his own life. That reflection would later become the symbol reporters replayed, frame by frame, on evening news broadcasts. The instant when one man's private disaster turned into a public reckoning. The garden hose across the fence had ruptured hours earlier, spraying unchecked. What Harold Mendez, his next-door neighbor, dismissed as just water, was in fact a tidal wave carving through walls, appliances, and memories. Cardboard boxes floated like forgotten boats. Photo albums, soaked and unreadable, plastered against the staircase. The basement clock. His late father's ticked underwater until it died, hands frozen at 1:42 a.m. Ethan whispered to no one, "This isn't water. This is everything I worked for." But the water did not care. It carried away his savings, his heirlooms, his sense of safety. Upstairs, his daughter's toys, pink stuffed animals and plastic castles were dripping, waiting to be thrown out in trash bags. Bling whispered, "Gone." The camera caught Ethan again, leaning against the doorframe, knees locked. In the reflection, he looked less like a homeowner and more like a defendant awaiting judgment. It was a verdict, waiting to happen. Harold's voice arrived hours later when Ethan confronted him. The man in slippers and a stained t-shirt shrugged, cigarette glowing in the dark. "Relax, it's just water. It'll dry." "This isn't a puddle," Ethan shot back. "It's my life savings underwater." Harold smirked. "If your basement wasn't so cheap, it wouldn't flood." That exchange, overheard by a third neighbor, became evidence. Words not meant to echo ended up carved into transcripts, forever attached to the case. He thought it was just a broken hose. Yeah, the court thought otherwise. The opening act of the story could have ended here, as nothing more than a sad homeowner sweeping water out of his basement. But this was America, where negligence is not a shrug, but a lawsuit. What began with the hiss of a leaking hose would soon thunder into a courtroom packed with journalists, students of law, and neighbors who had taken sides as though it were a local election. Because this wasn't just Ethan's basement. It was a mirror held up to every community. What happens when responsibility drowns in arrogance? The broken hose was trivial. The negligence behind it was not. In legal terms, it was foreseeable, preventable, and undeniable. In human terms, it was betrayal. A neighbor choosing indifference over accountability. The storm that night wasn't outside. It was inside Ethan's home, filmed by a camera, reflected in the water, and replayed in millions of living rooms across the country. From the very first drop, the case was already writing itself. He thought it was water. It was a verdict waiting to happen. Ethan Carter was 42 years old, but the lines around his eyes carried the weight of 50. He wasn't old, not in body, but in worry. By day he worked as an IT engineer, long hours, glowing screens, endless tickets filed and fixed. By night, he came home to the one thing he was proudest of, a modest 2-story house with a basement he had renovated himself. That basement was not just extra square footage. It was the vault of his dreams. Boxes carefully labeled, a wall of family photos, a corner turned into a small workspace where he kept his late father's tools. Ethan had been the neighbor people waved at when walking their dogs. The man who shoveled his part of the sidewalk early and left salt for others to use. He wasn't flashy, he was reliable. The kind of man you'd want living next door, another resident would testify later. But reliability came at a cost. Mortgage payments kept him awake at night. Sometimes his wife found him in the kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at the bills spread across the table. In his journal, discovered by his daughter when she was coloring nearby, he had scrawled one line in block letters, "Mortgage due. Don't lose this house." That was his weakness. his fear of losing it all. Years of saving, patching drywall, painting walls himself to avoid contractor fees, all so his family could have stability. That fear made him cautious, sometimes too cautious. Friends joked he checked the locks 3 times before bed. But in a world where one mistake could mean foreclosure, Ethan preferred caution over collapse. Across the fence lived Harold Mendez, 58, retired from a city maintenance job. He had lived on the block for nearly 3 decades. People described him as the old guard, the kind of neighbor who remembered when the trees were saplings and treated longevity as a badge of superiority. He mowed his lawn late at night, left tools scattered, and insisted that any dispute on the block should go through him first. To newcomers, Harold's laugh sounded warm. To those who stayed longer, it was condescending, a reminder that he had been there before them and would outlast them too. His reputation was built not on kindness, but on dominance. One neighbor recalled how Harold once shouted down a delivery driver for parking too close to his driveway. Another remembered him blasting music at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, daring anyone to call the cops. And yet, people rarely challenged him, because Harold was the kind of man who didn't just argue, he escalated. The clash between Ethan and Harold wasn't born from water. It was born from contrast. Ethan represented order, spreadsheets, savings, careful preparation. Harold embodied chaos, casual negligence dressed up as authority. Their collision was inevitable, like 2 tectonic plates quietly grinding until the earthquake hit. The first hint of that earthquake came months before the flood, at a neighborhood barbecue. It was a sunny afternoon, kids running with dripping popsicles, grill smoke painting the air. Ethan had just moved in and was trying to be friendly. He approached Harold with 2 beers, an olive branch across the property line. Harold accepted the drink, slapped Ethan's back hard enough to make him spill some foam, and declared loudly for others to hear. "In this neighborhood, I make the rules." S.E. Laughter followed, but it wasn't the friendly kind. It was the nervous chuckle people make when power speaks through a smile. Ethan forced a grin, but his wife caught the tension in his jaw. That sentence, offhand for Harold, planted itself like a weed in Ethan's mind. Later, when lawyers dissected the relationship between the 2 men, that barbecue moment would surface as the foreshadowing of everything that went wrong. For months, they orbited each other in silence. Ethan kept his head down, repaired his fence, mowed his lawn on schedule. Harold let hoses run, let sprinklers spray into the street, let his dog bark until midnight. Their lives touched only through small frictions, the kind neighbors shrug off. But friction, unaddressed, generates heat. Ethan's daughter once asked, "Why, Mr. Why?" Mendez always yelled at delivery drivers. Ethan replied carefully, "Some people think being loud makes them right." He didn't want to poison her view of neighbors, but he also couldn't pretend Harold's arrogance wasn't visible to a child. Harold, meanwhile, viewed Ethan as the anxious newcomer. He mocked Ethan's triple checking of locks. He told others at the corner store that Ethan was the kind of guy who'd sue you if your leaves fell on his driveway. The irony would later taste bitter. What made Harold dangerous wasn't just his negligence. It was his belief that longevity excused it. "I've been here 30 years, he often said, as though time itself had appointed him sheriff of the block. In his mind, Ethan wasn't an equal. He was a tenant on Harold Street. That belief collided with Ethan's desperation to protect his home. When the hose burst and the basement drowned, it wasn't merely property damage. It was the eruption of years of quiet imbalance. Ethan saw not just water, but Harold's contempt pouring into his walls. Harold saw not just a lawsuit, but rebellion against his unwritten rule. From a legal perspective, the setup was textbook. A plaintiff with clear financial harm, a defendant with a record of arrogance. But beyond the law, it was mythic. Caution versus chaos. Justice versus pride. Neighbors would later testify to Harold's words at that barbecue. "In this neighborhood, I make the rules." Some shrugged it off as a joke. Others admitted it revealed something deeper, that Harold treated accountability as optional. And Ethan's journal, entered quietly into evidence, showed the other side, a man terrified of losing his sanctuary. On the page, smudged from a spilled coffee, the words stared back at him. Mortgage due. Don't lose this house. That contrast. One man who feared loss so deeply he measured every risk, and another who dismissed responsibility as beneath him, wasn't sustainable. The hose was simply the trigger. The real story was two worldviews colliding, and the neighborhood watching to see which would survive. Because every block has its Ethan, the man holding his home together with careful hands. And every block has its Harold, the neighbor whose negligence drips louder than his laughter. Put them side by side, and the ending writes itself. But what nobody knew then was that the ending wouldn't stop at a basement. It would spill into a courtroom, into headlines, into classrooms where future lawyers debated the meaning of negligence. The seeds of that reckoning were already planted at a barbecue, in a journal, in the silence between two houses. All it needed was water to make them grow. It began with a hiss so faint it could have been mistaken for cicadas in the summer night. But it wasn't nature. It was neglect. Harold Mendez had dragged his garden hose across the yard earlier that day, attached it to a rusted spigot, and left it running. By evening, the rubber had cracked open near the nozzle, unleashing a steady stream that soaked the lawn, then crawled under the fence, and finally poured into the slope that led directly to Ethan Carter's basement windows. Ethan didn't notice at first. He was upstairs, reviewing code on his laptop, while his wife read beside him. It wasn't until the smell reached him. The damp, metallic odor of water pressing against old wood, that his stomach tightened. He pushed back his chair, descended the basement steps, and froze at the sight. 40 centimeters of murky water swallowing the room he had spent years building. The camera in the corner flickered. It captured Ethan standing at the threshold, mouth open, body rigid. The reflection off the water showed him as an inverted figure. His world literally turned upside down. That haunting image would resurface in court exhibits and television specials, a symbol of how quickly ordinary life can drown in someone else's carelessness. Furniture floated like abandoned ships. His father's tool chest bobbed near the stairs, drawers spilling wrenches into the dark. A family photo, its glass cracked, drifted face down. Insurance papers soaked on the desk curled like burned pages. Every detail screamed loss, not just of objects, but of security, of effort, of history. Ethan sloshed forward, heart pounding, and tried to lift the boxes onto higher shelves, but it was already too late. His knees buckled as he grabbed the frame of his daughter's drawing. A stick figure family under a sun, only to watch the crayon colors smear into an unrecognizable blur. He clenched his fists. His voice cracked, but carried a raw edge. This isn't a puddle. It's my life savings underwater. The words echoed against concrete walls before being swallowed by the gurgling flood. By dawn, Ethan marched next door, drenched jeans clinging to his legs. Harold stood on his porch in slippers, cigarette dangling from his lip. He surveyed the damage like it was a minor inconvenience, the kind that would evaporate with the morning sun. Relax, Harold sneered, puffing smoke. It's just water. It'll dry. Ethan's jaw locked. That water destroyed everything in my basement. You left the hose on. Harold exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. If your basement wasn't so cheap, it wouldn't flood. The conversation was overheard by a neighbor who later testified in court. To them, Harold's tone wasn't casual. It was mocking, a dismissal of accountability. Still, Ethan held on to hope that insurance might rescue him. He called his provider, pacing the living room with a phone pressed to his ear. His voice trembled as he described the damage. But the agent's reply was cold, procedural, devastating. I'm sorry, sir. Water damage from neighbor negligence isn't covered under your policy. Ethan's chest hollowed. A second blow, harder than the first. Not only was his home ruined, no safety net would catch him. Outside, Harold flicked his cigarette, the ember hissing as it landed in a puddle. He leaned on the porch railing, voice sharp with contempt. Sue me if you dare. That line became infamous. When reporters later replayed the saga, they always paused at those 4 words, the careless challenge that transformed a private disaster into a legal battle. The symbols of that night told their own story. Insurance papers, ink bleeding into unreadable stains, a wooden cabinet collapsing in slow motion, drowned beyond repair. A child's toy horse bobbing near the stairs, its plastic mane slick with mud. They were more than objects, they were evidence, metaphors for everything Ethan stood to lose. Neighbors gathered, whispering as they watched the water pumped out. Some sympathized, shaking their heads. Others muttered that Ethan was overreacting. Accidents happen. But Ethan knew this wasn't an accident. It was negligence, dressed as indifference. The trigger wasn't the hose alone. It was Harold's smirk, the insurance denial, the way laughter cut through Ethan's pain like a blade. Each element stacked like bricks on Ethan's chest until he couldn't breathe without tasting injustice. This wasn't just water, it was a question. What happens when one man's arrogance drowns another man's livelihood? Legal scholars would later call it a classic tort case. But to Ethan, standing in the wreckage, it was personal. Every box of ruined memories reminded him of the journal entry he had written weeks earlier. Mortgage due. Don't lose this house. Now the house itself was slipping away, piece by piece, under the weight of another man's neglect. The trigger had been pulled. A lawsuit wasn't a choice anymore, it was survival. The basement was evidence. The reflection in the flood was testimony. And Harold's cigarette, extinguished in the water, was the punctuation mark at the end of Ethan's patience. Because in that moment, Ethan realized, silence would only drown him further. Action was the only way to breathe. For 2 days, Ethan tried to swallow the humiliation like a bitter pill. He told himself it wasn't worth the fight. Lawsuits were messy, soldiers were expensive. Neighbors would gossip. Maybe, if he worked extra hours, cut expenses, he could repair the basement slowly. He convinced himself that peace with Harold, even an artificial peace, was better than open war. But Harold didn't just ignore the damage. He mocked it. Standing on his porch, he repeated his jab for anyone within earshot. If Carter's basement wasn't so cheap, it wouldn't flood. The words carried across fences like smoke, seeping into Ethan's kitchen window. His wife's face flushed with anger. His daughter, only 8, overheard and whispered, "Daddy, why does Mr. stay? Mendez hate us?" Ethan had no answer. His silence in that moment felt like surrender. That night, he printed out the complaint form, a stack of stark legal pages waiting for ink. He stared at them under the kitchen light, pen trembling in his hand. He thought about tearing it up. Filing a lawsuit against a neighbor wasn't who he was. He was the man who salted sidewalks, who waved first. He didn't want to become the villain of whispered conversations on the block. His hand hovered, ready to crumple the paper when his daughter padded into the kitchen, clutching a plastic horse salvaged from the flood. Its mane was discolored, the once bright pink dulled by mud. She looked at the trash bag where her other toys lay ruined and asked softly, Daddy, why are my toys floating in the trash bag?" The question cut deeper than any insult Harold had thrown. Ethan felt something inside him shift, like a lock turning. He looked down at her small hands gripping the ruined toy and realized that silence was no longer a form of peace. It was complicity. He signed the complaint. The next morning, he carried the papers to his lawyer's office. Not just any lawyer. Rachel Kim, 35, sharp-eyed, with a reputation for dismantling arrogance in courtrooms. She listened as Ethan described the flood, her pen scratching across a yellow legal pad. She didn't interrupt, didn't soften the silence when his voice cracked describing the photo albums lost. When he finished, she leaned back, crossed her arms, and delivered a sentence that would frame the entire case. IA. CASA. CAS like this don't just pay bills. They set standards. Ethan frowned. Standards? Rachel nodded. If you let negligence slide, you're telling every neighbor, every landlord, every careless hand that they can shrug and walk away. You're not just fighting for your basement. You're fighting for accountability. Her words struck like a gavel. For the first time since the flood, Ethan felt his spine straighten. Rachel promised to handle the storm. She spoke with a confidence that bordered on steel. 2. We'll subpoena the footage. We'll call witnesses, and we'll put his arrogance on trial as much as his hose. 2 neighbors quietly approached Ethan in the days that followed. One had overheard Harold's taunts. Another had seen the hose spraying long after midnight. They agreed to testify. Not everyone sided with Ethan, but the ones who did gave him enough to feel less alone. It is, the shift was visible. Neighbors who once shook their heads at just water began whispering about precedent, about fairness, about how easily their homes could be next. Ethan, once defined by worry, now carried himself differently. He still woke at 2 a.m., but not from fear, from preparation. He read through insurance clauses, highlighted statutes Rachel suggested, practiced his statement aloud. The man who once thought silence preserved peace now realized silence was a weapon used against him. In that transformation lay the turning point. From a passive victim watching his memories float away, Ethan became a plaintiff with purpose. The basement was no longer just a room, it was Exhibit A. His daughter's question was no longer innocent curiosity. It was a mandate. Rachel's words weren't advice, they were a battle cry. The law was no longer an abstract system of codes and precedents. It was a lifeline. And so the lawsuit was filed. Headlines would later call it the flood case. But for Ethan it had another name. In the privacy of his journal, beneath the old entry that read, "Mortgage due." "Don't lose this house," he added a new line. "Justice due. Don't lose this fight." Ethan didn't want to go public. At first, he believed the lawsuit would be enough. The courtroom was where battles were supposed to unfold, not the internet. But his wife, watching him slump at the kitchen table with bills stacked like bricks, told him the truth. If no one sees what happened, no one will care what you're fighting for. So one evening, he opened his phone, scrolled through the images, and chose the one that hurt most. His daughter's stuffed bear floating face up in the flooded basement. He posted it on Facebook with a short caption, "This is what happens when negligence meets arrogance." The photo spread faster than he expected. Within hours, it collected dozens of comments from neighbors, friends, strangers. The block fractured online as it had never done in person. Some voices dismissed it. Accidents happen. Why drag a neighbor to court? Just fix it and move on. Others rallied in outrage. If we don't hold people accountable, who's next? Could be my house tomorrow. H.W. What had been a private lawsuit became a neighborhood referendum. The local newspaper caught wind. A reporter called Ethan the next morning, asking for an interview. Within 2 days, an article appeared with the headline, "Flooded Basement Sparks. Legal War Between Neighbors." The story painted Ethan as a hard-working homeowner, Harold as the longtime resident too proud to admit fault. Harold, reading the paper on his porch, crushed it in his fist. He decided to fight not just in court, but in the court of opinion. He hired a lawyer known for aggression rather than finesse. A man who smiled like a wolf and thrived on intimidation. Together, they crafted a counter-narrative. Ethan wasn't a victim. He was an opportunist. He was exaggerating the damage to cash out. Rumors spread. Harold told anyone who'd listen at the corner store that Ethan's basement had been already falling apart and that he was using the hose as an excuse. He even claimed Ethan staged the photos. Then came the threats. One night, as Ethan wheeled his trash can to the curb, Harold called across the fence, voice dripping with menace. "You sue me, and I'll make sure you regret it." The words weren't shouted, they were whispered loudly enough to be overheard. And they lodged in Ethan's chest like splinters. But the tide began to shift when social media delivered its blow. A short video appeared on TikTok filmed by a teenage neighbor showing Harold arguing with Ethan the night of the flood. In it, Harold smirked and said the now infamous line, "I-teen. Not my problem." The clip went viral, captioned with bold white letters. "Not my problem, neighbor." It amassed hundreds of thousands of views, then millions. Comments poured in, classic negligence. "Imagine being this arrogant while your neighbor's house drowns." Sue him into the ground. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict. Harold was guilty of apathy. Even neighbors who had stayed neutral began to waver. One couple who had initially defended Harold approached Ethan in the driveway, awkward but sincere. We thought it was just a misunderstanding. But, after seeing that video, it's clear, we'll stand with you. That moment mattered more than clicks or headlines. For the first time, Ethan felt the neighborhood bending toward justice rather than fear. Harold, however, escalated. Fury replaced denial. He hammered a wooden sign into his front lawn, painted in red letters for all to see. Beware of the crybaby next door. The sign was photographed, shared, mocked online. To Harold, it was defiance. To the community, it was proof of cruelty. Even those who disliked lawsuits began murmuring, "That's too far." The street itself became a stage. Cars slowed to gawk. Strangers took photos. Journalists knocked on doors. Children whispered about the crybaby sign as though it were a ghost story. Rachel Kim, Ethan's lawyer, warned him not to let the circus distract him. "This case will be won with evidence, not sympathy." But Harold just handed us both. She was right. Every action Harold took, every sneer, every rumor, every sign, was evidence not of innocence, but of arrogance. The stress mounted. Ethan's nights filled with pounding thoughts. What if the court believed Harold's lies? What if the neighbors turned again? What if the mortgage crushed them before justice arrived? His wife tried to reassure him, but the weight pressed heavier with each passing day. And yet, he pressed on, because something bigger was at stake now. The lawsuit was no longer just about drywall and waterlogged furniture. It was about whether negligence could be laughed off, whether responsibility could be drowned in mockery. The neighborhood watched like jurors before the trial had even begun. They argued in online forums, at church, in grocery aisles. The line between personal feud and public test blurred. The case had become a mirror reflecting the question everyone feared. If we can't hold each other accountable, what protects any of us? The conflict rose like water, swelling beyond basements and fences, spilling into the community, the media, the internet. Each headline, each clip, each rumor was another gallon pouring into the flood. And in the center stood Ethan. Once a silent, anxious man, now the unwilling figurehead of a movement. He didn't ask for this role, but Harold's arrogance had written him into it. And now, as the trial loomed closer, it was no longer about two men on opposite sides of a fence. It was about everyone watching, waiting, wondering which side of justice they would live on when the verdict came. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and nerves. By the time Ethan Carter and his attorney, Rachel Kim, walked through the heavy wooden doors, the benches were already packed. Journalists balanced notepads on their knees. Local TV cameras angled for glimpses of the two men whose feud had spilled far beyond a fence line. The case was no longer a private grievance. It had become theater, a public referendum on responsibility. The bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise." Judge Miriam Lawson, stern-eyed and deliberate, entered. The gavel struck once, sharp as a gunshot. Silence fell like a curtain. Rachel leaned toward Ethan, whispering, "Stay calm. Truth is heavier than noise." On the opposite table, Harold Mendez sat slouched, arms crossed, his lawyer whispering strategies into his ear. Harold's eyes scanned the crowd with defiance, as though the room itself was trespassing on his property. The plaintiff's case began with visuals. Rachel dimmed the lights and played footage from a neighbor's security camera. The screen filled with grainy black and white images of a hose spraying relentlessly into the night. Water cascaded toward the fence, unstoppable, like a miniature flood in slow motion. Gasps scattered through the room. Next came the receipts, stacks of invoices, repair estimates, photographs of ruined furniture and electronics. Rachel handed them to the judge and jury. The total, $48,000 in damages. Each page was a silent scream of financial ruin. Then, witnesses. The Johnsons, a middle-aged couple who lived next door, took the stand. Mr. Johnson's voice shook slightly as he recalled the night of the flood. We heard Harold say, "Not my problem." Clear as day. His wife nodded, confirming. The words landed heavier in the courtroom than they ever had in a driveway. Rachel turned to the jury, her tone sharp. Negligence is not an accident. It's a choice. Harold's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection, argumentative. Judge Lawson raised a hand. Sustained. Jury will disregard the counsel's last remark, but the sentence had already embedded itself in the jurors' minds like ink on blotting paper. When Harold's lawyer rose, he framed his client as the victim of exaggeration. His voice carried confidence, but it dripped with condescension. A. Ladies and gentlemen, my client cannot be held responsible for rainwater. Basements flood, it happens. Rachel rose instantly, cutting through his words like a blade. T.S. Except it wasn't rain. She slapped a photo on the evidence board, the hose gushing. It was a hose he left running. For 12 hours. Murmurs erupted. The judge banged her gavel. Order. The tension was palpable. Every exchange felt less like dialogue and more like combat. When Ethan was called, the room leaned in. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Rachel guided him gently. English. Mr. Carter, what did you see when you opened your basement door? Ethan's throat tightened. He inhaled. I saw 40 centimeters of water. I saw my daughter's toys floating in trash bags. I saw my father's clock die underwater. I saw my savings gone. Rachel nodded. And what did you hear your neighbor say when you confronted him? K.A.S. Relax. It's just water. It'll dry. The words echoed in the room like a cruel joke. Then, Ethan delivered the line that reporters would later print in headlines. Silence doesn't keep you safe. Proof does. And my proof is floating in destroyed memories. For a moment, no one breathed. Even Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Rachel saved her sharpest weapon for last. She queued up the TikTok video, the clip that had gone viral across the internet. The room filled with Harold's smirk and the infamous phrase, "Not my problem." The reaction was electric. Gasps, whispers, a few muffled laughs of disbelief. The video wasn't just evidence, it was humiliation, magnified by millions of strangers who had already judged him. Harold's lawyer objected furiously, but Judge Lawson allowed it. The video goes to credibility and intent, she ruled. As cross-examination began, Harold's lawyer tried to paint Ethan as melodramatic. He suggested the basement had pre-existing issues. He implied Ethan wanted an easy payout. Ethan answered calmly, his voice steady, his story consistent. Then Harold snapped. Rachel pressed him on why he hadn't turned off the hose. His face reddened, his hands clenched. Finally, he slammed his palm against the table. Just, I left the hose on. So what? His voice thundered. He should have built a better house. The courtroom froze. Time seemed to pause, every gaze fixed on him. Judge Lawson banged the gavel. Order. Order. The record will note the defendant's admission. It was the moment the case shifted irrevocably. Harold's arrogance had leapt from rumor to record, from perception to proof. Ethan, watching from the witness stand, leaned forward just enough for Harold to hear. Negligence doesn't leak quietly. It floods lives. The line sliced through the silence like a verdict of its own. The trial wasn't over, but the room had decided. Journalists scribbled furiously. A law student in the back row whispered to a friend, "This is negligence 101." He admitted it himself. The legal principle was clear. Negligence required duty, breach, causation, and damages. Harold had a duty not to let his hose flood a neighbor's home. He breached that duty by leaving it running. The causation was filmed, the damages documented, and now arrogance had provided the final nail, his own words. Rachel's closing was less fiery than expected, but it didn't need to be. This case is not about water. It is about responsibility, about whether a man can shrug while his neighbor drowns, financially, emotionally, literally. Negligence is not an accident. It is a choice. Today, you have the choice to hold him accountable. Harold's lawyer sputtered through his closing, attacking Ethan's motives, but the jury's eyes had already hardened. As the gavel struck to adjourn, the courtroom buzzed. Outside, cameras awaited. Inside, Ethan sat still, heart pounding, not in fear but in release. For months he had been gasping under the weight of water and worry. Now, for the first time, he felt air in his lungs. Because the flood wasn't just in his basement. It had poured into the courtroom, washing away excuses, exposing arrogance, and leaving only truth behind. And Harold Mendez, once the self-proclaimed ruler of the neighborhood, had drowned in his own words. The verdict arrived not with fireworks, but with the sharp crack of the gavel. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The defendant, Harold Mendez, is ordered to pay damages in the amount of $60,000, including repair costs and legal fees. The words drop like stones into a silent pond. No cheers, no outbursts. Just the heavy silence of inevitability. Harold's head lowered, his jaw clenched. The man who once declared he made the rules of the neighborhood now stood as nothing more than a cautionary tale. His lawyer shifted papers quickly, avoiding eye contact with the jury. Across the aisle, Ethan closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. His wife squeezed his hand. For months, the weight of damp drywall and ruined memories had pressed on his chest. Now, a different weight lifted. Not joy, not triumph, but vindication. Outside, the courthouse steps overflowed with reporters. Microphones thrust forward like spears. Headlines raced onto screens before Ethan even spoke. Flooded basement, flooded courtroom with truth. The phrase trended online within hours, shared alongside clips of Harold's outburst. Yes, I left the hose on. So what? The public didn't need commentary. His arrogance had written its own indictment. Neighbors who had once whispered skepticism now nodded in approval. The Johnsons, who had testified, hugged Ethan outside the courthouse. One elderly woman told a reporter, "He stood up not just for his house, but for all of us. We've all lived next to someone who thought rules didn't apply." Meanwhile, Harold emerged from the building flanked by his lawyer. Cameras captured the moment. He reached for a handshake from a longtime neighbor, who turned away coldly. Another neighbor crossed the street to avoid him. In the parking lot he stood isolated, the hot sun casting a long, lonely shadow. The image became iconic. Harold Mendez, once self-appointed king of the block, dethroned not by force, but by law. For Ethan, the damages mattered. 60,000 meant repairs, stability, survival. But the deeper victory was intangible. He had been painted as dramatic, greedy, opportunistic. Now, the verdict washed that smear away. Standing at the microphones, he didn't gloat. He spoke quietly. This case was never about money. It was about accountability. We all share fences. We all share responsibility. Today, the court reminded us that negligence doesn't stop at property lines, it spreads. His words traveled farther than he imagined. Clips aired on national broadcasts, shared in legal forums, even translated into Spanish-language newspapers across the state. Law schools took note. Within months, the flooded justice case appeared on syllabi under Torts 101. Professors highlighted it as a modern example of negligence. Duty, breach, causation, damages, all crystal clear. Students debated the ethics of neighborly responsibility versus legal enforcement. One professor quipped, "This isn't just water damage. It's jurisprudence soaked to the studs." Insurance companies revised clauses in their policies, citing the case. Neighborhood associations circulated newsletters about maintenance duties. Even city councils referenced it when drafting ordinances about water runoff. What began as one broken hose had become precedent, rippling outward like the very flood that started it all. For Harold, the punishment extended beyond money. He became a pariah. Invitations stopped. Conversations ceased. Where once his booming laugh dominated block parties, now silence followed him. Children whispered, "Not my problem, neighbor," when he passed. the sign he had once planted. "Beware of the crybaby next door" was gone, torn down in shame. In its place, weeds grew. His lawn, once manicured aggressively, now stood as unkempt as his reputation. One evening, a local TV crew caught him standing alone in the supermarket parking lot, staring at a cart corral. No one approached him. The image spread online with captions like, "Negligence leaves you lonely." The case had proven what Rachel Kim told Ethan at the start. Some lawsuits aren't just about bills. They set standards. The verdict established that neighborly responsibility wasn't a matter of courtesy. It was law. Commentators framed it as a cultural shift. "For too long," one editorial read, "negligence has been excused as accident." This case reminds us that inaction is not innocence. It is liability. Rachel herself reflected in an interview. "People ask if this was worth the fight. I say yes because justice is not just personal, it's contagious." This verdict doesn't just repair a basement. It repairs trust in the idea that responsibility matters. In the weeks after the verdict, Ethan returned to the slow work of rebuilding. Contractors hauled out ruined cabinets, installed new insulation, sealed the basement walls. But some damage could never be undone. A photo album remained warped, its images blurred forever. A clock that once ticked in his father's workshop stayed still, glass fogged with watermarks. Ethan kept those ruined artifacts on a shelf, not as reminders of loss, but as proof of survival. When his daughter asked if they could buy new toys, he smiled gently. "We will. But these remind us why we stood up." The neighborhood's mood shifted too. Barbecues resumed. Children played across lawns. And though gossip never fully died, it tilted in Ethan's favor. He was no longer the crybaby. He was the man who fought and won. The law had spoken with numbers, $60,000. But justice had spoken with silence. The silence of Harold left alone in a parking lot, the silence of neighbors refusing his handshake, the silence of arrogance collapsing under its own weight. Because justice isn't only measured in dollars or decrees. It's measured in the space between people. Whether fences divide or connect, whether negligence is excused or condemned. In the end, Ethan's basement was rebuilt. But the case rebuilt something larger, the idea that accountability is not optional. That neighbors are bound not just by proximity, but by duty. The flood had destroyed walls, furniture, and memories. But it had also swept away indifference, leaving in its wake a precedent that would ripple through communities, classrooms, and courtrooms for years to come. Ethan Carter never celebrated. Not in the way people expected. There were no champagne corks, no triumphant dinners. After the verdict, after the headlines, he returned to his modest house on the quiet block and walked straight to the basement. There, stacked against the wall, were the remnants of what had survived. He knelt, one hand brushing against a warped picture frame. Inside, a family portrait smiled through streaks of water damage. The ink had bled, the edges curled, but the image was still there. Half ruined, half preserved. Ethan stood it upright on a shelf, alongside a few toys that had been salvaged. One stuffed bear still smelt faintly of mold, but his daughter insisted on keeping it. It was not victory. It was testimony, Ethan whispered, almost to himself. This is why we fought. By day, he slipped back into routine. His laptop glowed again with lines of code, support tickets, bug fixes. His coworkers noticed a new steadiness in his voice during meetings. He wasn't louder, but he carried weight differently, as if the verdict had built an invisible foundation beneath him. Neighbors waved with more warmth now. Yeah, some stopped to chat. A few even apologized for doubting him. But Ethan never gloated. He carried himself like someone who had touched the edge of despair and come back, not someone who had won a war. Weeks later, Rachel Kim called with an idea. "We should do more than fix your basement," she said. "We should fix the way people think about responsibility." Together, they organized a community forum in the local library. The sign outside read, "Property Responsibility and Neighbor Law. Lessons from the Flooded Justice Case." The room filled quickly. Homeowners, tenants, students, even city officials. At the front, Ethan sat beside Rachel. A projector displayed images. The hose captured on camera, the waterlogged basement, the courtroom sketch of Harold's outburst. Rachel spoke first. Negligence is not an accident, it's an injustice waiting to happen. This proved that responsibility doesn't end at your fence line. Then, Ethan rose. He looked at the crowd, then at the reporters' cameras. His voice was quiet, but every syllable carried power. Without accountability is just noise. Lead loud, even when you whisper. The room stilled. Some scribbled notes, others nodded. The sentence became a headline by morning, quoted and shared across platforms. Rachel followed, her tone sharper. Negligence may start with a hose, but it ends with a precedent. The audience erupted in applause. Not thunderous, but sustained, a sound less of celebration and more of recognition. Legal analysts later dissected the case in journals. One article wrote, Carter v. Mendez demonstrated that civil responsibility is not a courtesy, but an enforceable duty. It reframed neighbor disputes not as petty quarrels, but as matters of justice. But for Ethan, the meaning was simpler. He didn't want to be remembered as the man with the flooded basement. He wanted the story to remind people that silence is dangerous, that negligence is contagious, and that one voice, even whispered, can echo across a community. The last image the public saw of Ethan wasn't in court. It was at home, stacking those saved frames in his rebuilt basement. A news crew captured him placing the water-damaged photo on a shelf, straightening it carefully. The anchor's voiceover said, "Justice doesn't erase the scars. It honors them." For many viewers, that moment struck harder than the verdict itself, because it wasn't about dollars or decrees. It was about memory, about carrying both ruin and repair in the same hand. At the close of the community forum, Ethan addressed the crowd one last time. He broke the fourth wall, looking directly into the camera lenses. His voice was steady, almost intimate. If this story makes you think of an injustice that touched your life, don't stay silent. Share it. Because silence only feeds negligence, and negligence doesn't stop at fences. He paused, then added, "If this story moved you, share it. Not for me, but for the next neighbor who wonders if their voice matters." Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, summing up with the line that would later adorn countless articles and lecture slides. Privacy. Negligence may drown a basement, but justice floats. In the years that followed, the case remained in law classrooms, in insurance policies, in neighborhood bylaws, but more importantly, it lingered in conversations about fences, about fairness, about accountability. Ethan went back to coding, back to mowing his lawn, back to waving at neighbors. But whenever he passed that warped photo on the shelf, he remembered the flood not as disaster, but as turning point. And though he never raised his voice, his whisper continued to echo. Power without accountability is just noise. Lead loud even when you whisper.